Productive Pastor 30, Preaching Islands, and How to Not Be a Castaway. What's going on, y'all? We're back. Chad Brooks, Productive Pastor. How's your week been going? You're heading into the weekend. Did you survive Halloween? Or let me rephrase that. Do you have enough small size Snickers floating around your office and your house for the next couple of weeks? Well, this episode is all about Preaching Islands. You can find the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/030. And I'm excited to have this conversation. But before we do that, just a couple of quick things. First of all, I've got something secret up my sleeve that's going to be done probably in about a week and a half. It should be cool. The second thing is this. I've got spots opening up in Q1 of next year for one-on-one coaching. This has been something that folks have been asking about, and I've been doing several different things as part of that. But I'm going to have a link in the show notes to where if you want to have a conversation about what one-on-one work might look like, you can drop that in there. You can book a 30-minute exploratory call, and we can talk about what that does. Now, what I've been doing a lot lately with people is a couple of things. One, working through personal ministry vision, understanding that. Also, just helping folks think through just kind of what does it mean to strategically lead at this point in time, like post-COVID, things are starting to sort out. So all of that. If that sounds interesting, I'd love for you to jump on, just fill that link out. My rates are going up and next year, but if you want to talk about that and get that booked this year, you'll still get this year's prices, which will be better and cheaper for you anyway. But we're not here to do that. We're here to talk about the Preaching Islands and all the normal fun stuff as part of Productive Pastor. So Preaching Islands and not being a castaway. So back in season 1, on the episode on preaching, it was episode 6, I talked about Preaching Islands just a bit. And they keep coming up in several things. I'm also doing a learning cohort right now on developing sermon rhythms. And we're talking about Preaching Islands as part of that. And so I realized I wanted to kind of give a whole episode to Preaching Islands. And also, if you don't get the Productive Pastor emails, the first one for this month came out. Those are always month-long specific themes. And this month is all about preaching. And so I wanted to talk about Preaching Islands, and I wanted to just drive a stake into the ground to have a piece of content I can point towards people anytime I have Preaching Island conversation. So if you want to get those emails, I'll post the link to the most recent one in the show notes. You can also grab and subscribe from that point in time. But let's think about those things. And so, defining a preaching island, and this is what I think about. There's this temptation for the sermon to be off of the mainland of the congregation, away from just the congregation's vision, their mission, the purpose, the clarity, all these sorts of things, just the power that the local church has. Preaching islands are when the sermons are just kind of broken off of the mainland and living out there on their own. I talk so much about John Chandler and his Sermon Smith podcast, how he started off every episode with the question, what is the role of the sermon in your context? And friends, that is a huge, powerful question. And in fact, if you're in your office, at your desk, whatever, I would encourage you, hit pause on the podcast for a few minutes, get out a piece of paper and try to answer that question. What is the role of the sermon in your context? And I realize it's such a powerful question because for years, I never actually thought about that. What do you expect the sermon to do? What does the congregation expect the sermon to do? What's the role? What does it play? And growingly over the last few years, I have this deep conviction that our sermons really are part of the discipleship engine in the local church, and that the sermons, can fulfill certain functions unlike and better than anything else. And so when we let our sermons live off of the mainland on islands, away from the vision, the mission, the larger culture, all those sorts of things, we lose the power that the sermon can bring. And this sermon becomes something that it can get done, and it might be technically good, but it doesn't really change anything. It's much like, if you're part of a traditional church or you grew up in a traditional church, remember, there always used to be a special. It's kind of like a really well-performed special or a nice prelude, or in the words of Shakespeare from Macbeth, it is full of sound and fury, but signifies nothing, that it's hollow. And nobody wants their sermon to be hollow. Now, caveat here, let's take a pause. Some of this seems absolutely wrong to say. And yes, I get it. There is, there's the Holy Spirit can do things. Yes, I understand that, but please don't start throwing Sunday school comments here. And I'm also not talking about some hyper-consumptive approach to the sermon as well, saying, oh, well, the sermon's just not practical. That sort of a thing. Let's just pull that kind of stuff out of the conversation. I also find sometimes folks have been dropping that into sermon conversations because they don't actually want to talk about their sermons and them being good or not being good and actually working on making them better. But, sermons that live on the mainland are both full of the Spirit in their preparation, but also full of the Spirit in the proclamation. They're edifying and they are changing to the congregation. And I feel like we need to be talking about this is also as well as just due to the current temperature of pastors in our current moment, because we're continuing to see an epidemic of clergy experiencing burnout, feeling disjointed from their congregation, disconnected from their call, all these sorts of things. I have a lot of these conversations one-on-one with people. And there's also this temptation then to act out in the sermon. That sounds kind of crazy, but you see it quite often. So what I want to share are 5 different sermon islands that we might unintentionally find ourselves on. And at the end of that, I wanted to share a few things quickly about what we can do to avoid these islands. So here are 5 islands that we might find ourselves on. The first one is the island of apathy. So when we are tired, what do we do? Or when we are frustrated with someone or something, what do we do? Apathy is one of the more complex emotions that we can deal with in our preaching. It can be as easy as saying, I'm tired, let me knock something together really quick. Or I think I have an old outline that I can probably preach so I can just kind of gain some time back. Or it also could be this idea of when you disrespect the congregation and you get almost into scolding mode. I've seen that happen as well. But when we're apathetic about what the role of the sermon is, we can misuse it. Apathy also happens, I feel like, sometimes with a certain amount of congregational neglect in which the preacher sees the sermon as something that happens outside of the church and not inside of spiritual community. I feel like we abuse the term prophetic at times, and it becomes actually an apathetic message. It also happens when the pastor wants to maintain some level of difference between them and the congregation. So this is one of the more complicated ones. But that's the thing, apathetic. The next island I want to talk about is the island of interest. Now, all of us have favorite things in the Bible. We have favorite characters. We have favorite themes. I've got several different trains that I'm just shoveling coal into right now that I'm really, really interested in. There's also just like theological concepts or ideas or this sort of thing that we as pastors who typically think about these spiritual things more than our congregation does, that we can be super, super interested in. And sometimes we can create a preaching island when we think the best way to exercise our thoughtfulness is us preaching through it. But we have to ask ourselves the question, is the congregation interested in this? Is there a benefit in my context beyond some sort of mental exercise? This island is created because it is something that is wildly different from what people are expecting or what they need and what they might engage with. Imagine taking a bunch of people to an Italian restaurant one night, a fantastic, amazing, great Italian restaurant, and then making everybody order the ground beef taco off the kids' menu. It just does not all line up. I think this is one reason for pastors that seem to be more into reading and into the thoughtfulness and the creation, this side of ministry. I think this is where it's important for them to have a place where they're writing or they're making YouTube videos, that sort of a thing, to have an outlet for these sorts of ideas so the sermon does not become it. And what you'll also find typically, and I found this personally, is once you give those things sometimes some months to make lapse, to think about it in your brain, to live in other places, then you'll actually find congregational application for this stuff that really, really does make an impact. So that's the island of interest. The next island is the island of disconnection. Now, what happens when a pastor simply just does not know the congregation and does not know the context? And this isn't just in preaching necessarily, but also in just like the outlook that the pastor has or the leadership direction the pastor has. Now, this can be a cultural thing, it can be a geographical, it can be an ethnic thing, it can be a political thing, all this. And I think this one, I do realize that folks from all sorts of streams listen to Productive Pastor, but as a United Methodist pastor, I'm going to say this one for people in a mainline system where you were sent to the church, or especially where you're appointed in the Methodist world. I think disconnection is an island that happens quite often because that cultural connection is not there automatically. When the pastor is disconnected just from the vibe of the congregation, that's an island we can live on. But the good news is, disconnection, even if the pastor's highly different, like from a different country or something like that, you can always build bridges and ferries. This disconnection can be easily managed by both the congregation and the pastor. And so it's thinking about this. Yes, we are different, but how can we be communicating and living together in spite of this? So that's kind of an interesting island. The next island is different, and I feel like this one has been one, for the last couple of years that has been the one that I know I've had to pay attention to, is this. It's the island of safety, that when things seem to be just absolutely out of control and disrupted, when church life is rough, think of like 2021 pandemic era kind of stuff, all of these sorts of things, that there's a temptation for the preacher to retreat into the study and into the sermon. And so this idea of I'm going to completely ignore all the things that very well might be significant spiritual issues or things we need to be speaking into and thinking about together as congregations. I'm just going to retreat into the study and decide to do like a sermon series on my 10 favorite Psalms. There's a peacefulness that can be brought about in the sermon, but also can be like this false peace. I feel like the island of safety is the island that happens when there's a tension with the preacher and they just need one thing to be normal in ministry, and the sermon becomes that. And this isn't necessarily harmful. I think all these islands are for the most part, can be relatively harmless, but it's outside of the larger purpose. And I think the good news is that the time and the energy that goes into preaching in these sorts of moments, especially, think of the latter half of 2020 and 2021, that it can be a powerful season of discernment and modeling within the congregation. What does it mean to listen to God? So rather than using the sermon to feed the anxiety monster, or using the sermon to escape and build you're going behind the wall of Helm's Deep to avoid the chaos monster, the sermon is seen as not this safe place, but as this, as John Tyson calls, the redemptive edge of what's going on. So that's the fourth island, is safety. The last island is this, and this word is going to sound kind of harsh, but if we really begin to pick it apart, we see where this comes from. And this is the island of ignorance. Now, all of these other islands can be small and can be occasional, but ignorance is the type of island that's just built up over time as this small little rise in the water, and then it catches more and more sand as the wind blows around it, and next thing you know, it's like supporting an ecosystem, and it's a barrier island. Ignorance takes a long time to build up. In some ways, ignorance is like disconnection, but on a massive scale, especially when time is of the issue, okay? So when pastors just never feel like they have enough time, when they just kind of consistently hammer out the easiest thing, this is the easiest thing for the pastor, this is where ignorance can happen. Sometimes these are sermons that look great in the bulletin. It can be a sermon on denominational distinctiveness or doctrinal standards, or preaching the newest book that's making its way through the clergy discussion groups. I remember, I don't know how many sermons I saw people preach on Todd Bolsinger's Canoeing the Mountains a few years ago. But there's something about the sermon being woefully disconnected for so long that the congregation doesn't even see the sermon as this like living and active thing happening in worship. And I'll call this unintentional neglect. Like nobody sets out to do this, but it's something that happens slowly over time until it just becomes part of the culture of just the worshiping body. And with this neglect comes both the loss of the preachers and the congregation's belief that God might just speak to them. And so that's that fifth island of ignorance. And so 5 islands, preaching islands, I just shared with you there. There's probably tons of more that you can think of. But how do we avoid preaching islands? And I'm going to go through these really, really quick. But some of this can get picked out, I feel like, on later episodes and just other places. But just, 5 easy ways that we can try to avoid sermon islands. The first is this. Pastors, they need to know their context, their congregations, and their cultures. You should be able to articulate pretty well what the biggest spiritual needs and blockages there are in your community. I'll tell you, my favorite place to understand where does my community need Jesus is to go to the gas station. Like, if you can find the gas station that sells, like, I'm in the deep south, so every gas station has, like, the fry counter, like, all of, like, the meat pies and pizza sticks and that sort of thing, like boudin balls, get that. If they have, like, a table or two, just sit there for, like, an hour and observe, and you will begin to understand what the spiritual needs just in your culture are there, and then you can start asking questions like that to the congregation, that sort of thing. Like, you need to know your context, congregation, and culture. The second thing is this. Pastors need a robust devotional life where they are listening and waiting on the Lord. Because this is the thing. If you're not experiencing these moments on your own, it's going to be really easy to just justify a spiritual lecture or a compelling talk about a spiritual issue or problem that is seen from afar and then brought into the congregation. And here's the thing, whether it be positive or negative, it might not actually even be living there. And so there's something about, understanding your culture, context, and congregation and having a robust devotional life and practicing just these modes of discernment yourself to begin thinking about this. The third thing is this, know what your go-tos are. This will help you avoid the unintentional side of preaching islands. Like, I know that I have a handful of places I always go, and I'm aware of those, and I run my sermons through that filter and just say, Chad, are we kind of consistently taking people to the exact same place every time? Now, I know that I've said, and people joke about, preachers only have one sermon, which is true, but let's think about the ways like we might be creating a trail because it's just the path we always take. So just think about what your go-tos are. I think this is one of the benefits of having a yearly preaching calendar is not so much that you're going to plan ahead and do every single thing like that, but so you can be aware of, okay, this is where I have been for the last 6 months. And so this is that. I mean, are you creating a tiny little place that's catching more sand and growing grass? And the fourth thing, know your congregation's theological development, but also their needs. And this is going to sound silly, but learn the power of surveys. I want to get a friend of mine from Twitter on the show to talk about how he gave his congregation a theological survey as part of their vision discernment, because he wanted to know where his folks were. And you also can survey for just the biggest things that are in people's hearts and their minds. I used to use a congregational survey every October before I planned out kind of the big map of my preaching for the year. And so think about the power of survey and think about the questions you can ask. And don't do the, what would you like to hear a sermon on? Instead, think like, what is the thing that you are worried about the most right now? Or what do you want for your children? Or if one thing could change in our community, what would it be? You ask these big, huge, open-ended questions to where you're not getting someone's head, but you're hearing from their heart. And so, don't forget the power of a survey here. And the last one is this. And this is going to sound kind of simple, but share your pulpit. Let other folks, especially those people in the congregation, talk about their spiritual life and sit and listen. You might think about what are the testimonies looking like in my community? Where are people seeing God move? All those sorts of things. Allow the people in the pews spiritual development and stories begin to be owned by everybody that is there, because it builds up spiritual community. Now, I'm talking in the emails over the next few weeks about what does it mean to take the sermon and to stretch it out past Sunday and to let it live throughout the rest of the week. And a lot of those questions is asking about that. What is the role of the sermon in my congregation? And if it is seen as a discipleship piece, a component, this thing that unlike anything else, then you'll begin to realize, wow, this is a really powerful tool that deserves me putting thoughtfulness behind just what am I speaking on, and setting up and listening and discerning, like, what are the things that the Spirit's doing in our midst, all of this sorts of stuff. So friends, don't neglect the power of the sermon to be significantly larger than those 15, 20, 25, 40, 45-minute moments on Sunday morning. So thanks for coming in. Come over to the Productive Pastor Podcast community on Facebook. Let's talk about Preaching Islands in the comment thread on this post. It'd be a really cool, fun conversation to have. But I'm Chad Brooks. I am out, and I will see you back the next time in the next episode.